Welcome to the Living Well Church podcast, and thanks for tuning in today. Our mission as a church is to help people find faith in Jesus and a life of purpose and hope. You're about to watch a message that will challenge you, inspire you, encourage you, and most of all, point you to Jesus and the life of purpose and hope He has planned for you. So lean in and enjoy, and let God speak into your life.
Hello. So the last 2 weeks, we've been looking at transformation. Transformations as individuals and collectively also as a church. And we've had some really powerful messages from Beth and Marcus the last few weeks, and we've seen really great responses from people. And this week, I'm going to look at keeping your eyes focused on Jesus and how that can transform you. And I feel like each time I preach, that you will get to know a little bit more about me, what I'm like, how insufferable I can be. So if we're ever driving somewhere with my fiancée, and mid-conversation she's got to concentrate on where she's going and she's trying to work it out, she'll say, "Oh, just hold on." So I will. I'll grab onto the handlebar on the ceiling and I will stay like that until she tells me to let go. And she's from Texas, so you get a lot of insects and mosquitoes and flies. So if she sees one land on me, she's telling me to go, hold still and until she tells me to move. And I think I'm hilarious. She's not here to disagree, so we'll stick with that. I am funny. And as harmless as that is, there was a time I took someone's advice a little bit too literally. So I play a lot of cricket in the summer, and one sunny Saturday last summer, I was going out to bat, and the guy I was batting with, as I get to the crease, he says to me, something along the lines of, he's swinging it into your body, and he's got a bit of a sharp bounce to him, which probably sounds like gibberish to most of you. So I nodded my head, took it on board, and he said, just keep your eye on the ball, and you'll be fine. So he's a much better player than I am. He's a lot more experienced, and his advice has served me well in the past. So I did just that, and this was the result. Not the logo. Yeah, so that was day 0, day 1, day 2. So I did exactly what he said. I watched the ball from the bowler's hand as it bounced, as it raced past my bat, all the way to my eye, resulting in a fractured orbital bone and some pretty impressive bruising. Now, that definitely wasn't the best bit of advice to take literally. And fortunately for you guys, and for all of us, I'm not giving any cricketing tips today. But what I am going to talk about is 2 people from the Bible, one of who famously gave a lot of better advice than I received. And those 2 people are Joseph and Simon Peter. Joseph from Genesis, not Joseph, Jesus' father. So Joseph went from being the second youngest of 12 brothers and his father's favourite to being cast down a well by his older brothers, sold into slavery in Egypt, and once there being falsely accused and thrown into prison. And Simon Peter, who went from being a fisherman to Jesus' disciple to one of the most important people in the formation of the early church. They're 2 people who may not look like they have much in common, but they both fell into the same trap and into the same mistakes. As we look at Joseph, his story is found in Genesis. We're about halfway through his story and we find him in Genesis 40. He had tormented his brothers one time too many with story of these prophetic dreams that God had given him. Dreams where his brothers would come and they would bow down before him. They would submit to him. And to them, that was something that was so insulting to be told by their younger brother that he was going to be more important to them, that they would bow down and they would be in dominion under him. It was just completely countercultural to everything they know. And he told them it one too many times. So when he turned up one day in the fields, they threw him down a well, which doesn't sound like much fun. And whilst there, some of his brothers then sold him into slavery into nearby Egypt. And even then, as he is a slave in Egypt, he held on to those dreams that God had given him as a teenager, fully trusting that God was going to deliver on those promises. And as time passed by, he found himself as a chief servant in the home of an important man, the captain of Pharaoh's guards. And despite the fact that he was a foreign slave in a distant land, still God was with Joseph, and still Joseph trusted God. And Joseph ended up in a position of authority and elevated above those around him, despite the fact that he had no right to be or no reason to be. But whilst he was serving in that household, he was falsely accused by the captain's wife, and he ends up being thrown into jail. And it's there that we catch up with him in Genesis 40. And we know at this point that he's been in prison for quite a while, because in Genesis 39, it tells us that the prison warden trusted him so much that he put every other prisoner in the prison under his watch and under his command. And again, we see Joseph in a place he has no right to be, with power and authority and influence when he really shouldn't. But the whole time he has been there, he's trusted in God. He's trusted in his promises that God has given him. Promises that he was so strongly convicted by that he couldn't help but brag to his brothers about, knowing full well how much it would have annoyed them, knowing full well how strange it would have been in that time. But still he held on to those promises. Everywhere Joseph went, he went with God. And no matter what his situation, what his standing was, God had raised him above those around him. He had put him in a position of authority above his fellow slaves, his fellow servants, and then his fellow prisoners. Every step of Joseph's journey was walked with God. He knew as a teenager that God had a calling for his life. And he also knew that there was a journey from that call to the calling, that it wouldn't happen overnight. But despite knowing all of that, despite journeying for over 15 years with God from when his brother sold him as a slave, he gets to a point where he took his eyes off Jesus, away from God, and he doesn't trust him to deliver the promises that he's held on to for 15 years. And he tries to take matters into his own hands. Because whilst he's in jail, Pharaoh, who doesn't seem like the most even-keeled of people, gets annoyed with his cupbearer and his baker. Doesn't say what they did or even if they did anything bad, but they end up being thrown into jail. And whilst they're there, they both have these dreams that they can't understand. But Joseph, he offers to interpret them because he says that all dreams come from God. And just like that, Joseph does. He interprets their dreams through God. He interprets for both of them. He tells the cupbearer that Pharaoh will raise him back up out of prison and he will elevate him above his previous position. And that the baker, he's not going to fare so well. And that Pharaoh will have him killed. And as he delivered the good news to the cupbearer, as he tells him how Pharaoh will elevate him above his previous position, Joseph tries to take his destiny into his own hands. He takes it out of God's plan and out of God's timing. And as he interprets the dream and he tells the cupbearer, he says, "Remember me when you are with Pharaoh." Joseph all of a sudden saw what he thought was a perfect opportunity to elevate himself again, to get himself out of a jail that he could see no way out of, and a step closer to the promises God had made in his life. He poured out his heart to the cupbearer. He told him how unfortunate his life had been, how his brothers had sold him into slavery, how he'd been falsely accused, and how he'd been victimized. But still, when the cupbearer was released from jail, he went to be back with Pharaoh, and he forgot all about him for a very long time. And then moving forward a few thousand years, you have Simon Peter set himself up to make the same mistake that Joseph did. The same mistake that most of here will make, have made, or are making at the moment. Beth and Marcus both talked about this passage in the last few weeks, so they should be fresh and familiar to most people. And I don't think it's by chance that we've all used these same verses. And the verses are found in Matthew 14, 22 to 34. Here Jesus has sent his disciples off in a boat whilst he goes and prays. And whilst they're in the boat, they're set upon by a storm. And as the storm is raging all around them, they see what they think is a ghost on the water. But in actuality, it's Jesus. And Simon Peter cries out to him and says, "Jesus, if it's you, call me out, and I'll walk to you." And Jesus did just that. He calls him out, and he steps out of the boat, and he walks on water. Now, Beth used these verses when she was talking about the supernatural a few weeks ago, and there's not much more supernatural than walking on water. I'm not a scientist, but I know enough that it's physically impossible to walk on water. But there Peter was doing it, step by step, closer to Jesus who was calling him. Just a picture of Simon Peter in mind, of a guy who was a fisherman, who would have spent his life on water, getting out of the relative safety of a boat filled with more fishermen, to jump into the water in the middle of a storm. Just kind of baffles me, but he did it because Jesus was calling him. And as he stepped out of the boat, he stands on top of the water and he started to walk towards him. And it's at that point, as he is walking to the beckoning Jesus, that his story meets with Joseph from all those years before. Joseph, who from a young child had been given prophetic dreams by God, that he believed to, that he clung to, that he trusted and knew God was going to bring to truth. Dreams that he had held on to for over 15 years as a slave and a prisoner. But for one moment he took his eyes off what God had promised in his life. And despite everything Joseph went through in the years prior, trusting in God's promises and what he was calling Joseph to, through everything that had come before, Joseph had trusted in God's promises. He knew he was on a journey from the call to the calling. But whilst on that journey, for the briefest of moment, he lost his faith in God's promise over his life. And Simon Peter, stepping out of the boat, with all of the faith in the world, trusting in Jesus, as he saw him in front of him, the second he took his eyes off Jesus, he began to sink. Despite the fact that he'd had his eyes solidly fixed on Jesus, when he took him off them, he began to sink, despite the fact that he was literally walking in the miraculous, despite the fact that he had trusted Jesus' call enough to get out of the boat and to walk on water. As he journeyed towards the call in Jesus, doing what Jesus was asking of him, for the briefest of moments, he took his eyes off him. And in that moment, the physical storm raging around him distracted him from the journey, and he began to sink. And as he took his eyes off Jesus, he stopped trusting in Jesus' power to get him to the calling. In the same way that Joseph did not trust God to elevate him to this important position in Egypt, despite the fact that everywhere Joseph had been, God had elevated him. He had put him above others where he had no right to be. Everywhere he had been with God. That at every stage of his life, God had been with him. God ensured that he was safe and that he had prospered. And despite the fact that he was the second youngest of 12 brothers, the fact that he had been a foreign slave, that he had been thrown into jail, every step of Joseph's journey, he knew he was accompanied by God. Both Simon Peter and Joseph, despite one of their journeys being only seconds and the other being years, both started with their eyes firmly fixed on God, fully hearing the call that God had put on their lives. And as they started their journey from the call to the calling, lost my notes. They set out with their eyes fixed on God and trusting him in their journey. Simon Peter trusted Jesus so much, when he had his eyes fixed on him, he jumped out of his boat into a raging storm. Joseph clung to the prophecies through 15 years of captivity. But they both came to the point where the calling seemed so far away, they could see no way that God could deliver it, and they took their eyes off him. I think there are two types of people here. Those who are like Simon Peter in the boat. You're hearing the call of Jesus, and you're in that boat trying to decide, is this really Jesus that I'm hearing? Is it really him? Or is it like some figment of my imagination conjured up in the fear and in the noise of the storm? You've not made a commitment to follow Jesus yet, but you hear his call on your life. He's calling for you to get out of the boat and make that jump of faith and trust in him. And if that's you today, I want to tell you, that is Jesus, and he is calling you. He's calling you by name, because he is desperate for a relationship with you. He wants to be able to spend hours with you in worship. He wants to be there as you read the Bible and learn more of him and unwrap more of his calling on your life. He wants to journey every step of the way with you, from his call to your calling. But whilst we may not know it, God has a plan and a calling for each one of us. And Jesus sends each one of us out in Matthew 28 with the Great Commission to love and to evangelize to all people. But beyond that, God has a calling specific for your life, for how he wants you to serve him. And the response to that call is simple. All it is an act of obedience. If you've never done it before, it's a quiet moment of prayer, asking God into your life, asking him to forgive your past and loving him with all your heart, and giving everything you have to him, and starting that journey from the call to the calling. And in the second group, they're like Simon Peter as he's walking on the water, and Joseph as he's in jail for a crime he didn't commit. You're walking towards what Jesus is calling you to. But with each step, that calling feels so far away, so beyond what you could ever imagine capable, that you can't even see yourself doing what God is calling you to. You are so excited to hear that call, but now the time has come to start the transformation. Then all you can see is the storms raging around you and the prison walls above you, just as Simon Peter and Joseph did. Even though Simon Peter was walking on the water as Jesus was calling him, doing the very thing that Jesus asked in pursuit of him, still he lost his focus and took his eyes off Jesus and began to sink. Or you've been journeying with God, what feels like years with no transformation, that you've become complacent and you've had those moments of doubt where you take your eyes off God. Despite all that God has walked with you through to this point and all he has already done and transformed in you, you've become like Joseph, who can't see out of prison. And Joseph, who had spent years being downtrodden, enslaved, victimized, still, through all of that, he had kept walking with God towards his calling. Despite all those years of trust and focus, still he took his eyes off God. And today is a moment when we can fix our eyes back on Jesus and journey towards God's calling and keep our eyes fixed on him. Ever since I was young, I've known that God was calling me in my life. As a toddler, I was prophesied over in John Wesley's pulpit. As a teenager, I was prophesied over that I'd be a warrior like David. And as an adult, I was told I'd go beyond my great-granddad, my granddad, and my mum before me. And for a long time, I assumed that was all going to come at the touch of a button. But one day I'd wake up and I'd be all of those things. And I'd be ready to serve God how he wanted me to. But the older I got, and the more I realised it was a journey from the call to the calling. That for that to happen, I had to do my part. That I had to daily fix my eyes on Jesus. That I had to spend time on my knees, in worship, in prayer, and surrendering all to him. Everyone has a calling, and no matter the calling, the response is the same. And knowing that should excite you, because it's not a burden that should weigh heavy upon our shoulders. Joseph, through his calling, saved his entire family. If God hadn't put him in the position he had, if he hadn't given him the dreams he had as a teenager, then he would never have been in Egypt to prepare for the famine and to be able to save his brothers and his father and his family. And there are people here today who have been waiting days, weeks, months, or even years, like Joseph was, to get where Jesus is calling you. And no matter what group you fall into today, if you're about to get out of the boat for the first time, or if you feel like Joseph thrown into jail with no way to see over the walls, then it is so important to read on in both of their stories. Because as Simon Peter started to sink, where he was at his most vulnerable, in the moment where he needed Jesus most, he cried out to him, "Lord, save me." And Joseph, despite finding himself in jail, with seemingly no way out, still God saw that the dreams he had given him as a child, as a teenager, came true. God didn't forget the promises he had made Joseph, no more than he will forget the promises he has made any one of us. Joseph was on a journey from the call to the calling, the same as each one of us here. And no matter what part of the journey you're on, if you're just hearing that call for the first time, or you feel you've been chasing that for years, and you're struggling to fix your eyes on Jesus every day, as we close in a moment and sing our last song, take this moment to cry out to God, to ask him to help you, to lift you up the way he pulled Simon Peter out of the waves, and Joseph out of prison into the promises he had prophesied over their lives. And for me, I think keeping your eyes fixed on Jesus is a really simple task, but it's not easy. It can come with a cost. It takes determination and dedication, and the journey from the call to the calling will take time. Jesus did not pull Simon Peter out of the waves, put him on the boat, and tell him to abandon everything and go build my church. He journeyed with him. He stepped every day with him to the end of his life. And then even when he was dead, he didn't abandon him. He didn't leave him on his own. As Jesus departed earth, God sent his Holy Spirit in his place to be our constant companion, our constant guidance. Joseph didn't go from teenager with extravagant dreams to one of the most important men in the ancient world overnight. It was through journey with God that shaped his life to answer the calling in his life. And if in this last song you make that decision to cry out to God and ask for his help, the same applies to you as well. That moment is another step on the journey, a journey that will happen every day for the rest of our lives. And for me, the best way to fix your eyes on Jesus daily is to do what we're told in the Bible by God. But that doesn't mean God wants to micromanage our lives. He doesn't want to dictate how we spend our days. What he wants is really clear in the Bible. He wants you to know him, and he wants you to spend every day fixed on him, doing what you can to become more Christ-like. And if you spend every day of your eyes fixed on God, in communion with him, worshipping him, praying with him, sharing your heart with him, surrendering to him, then I think it's impossible not to become more Christ-like the more we do. And as we do it, you journey more with God, closer to his calling in your life. Use today as a springboard for the next step of your journey. Make the decision to go from today and spend every day of your eyes fixed on Jesus. To wake up each day and to pray. To spend time each day listening to worship. To spend time each day reading your Bible. And to give yourself time to listen and hear from God. So as we sing your last song, if you want to keep your eyes fixed on Jesus through the journey from the call to the calling, then cry out to him. Do as Simon Peter did, literally cry out and ask him for his help. And just as he pulled Simon Peter out of the waves, he will meet you in your need where you are and journey with you from the call to the calling.